that has kind of dominated all of our thoughts for the last couple of days has been the death of Mr. Herbert W. Armstrong. It was not entirely unexpected in the sense that the man is 93 years old, or was 93 years old, and was not in good health, but nevertheless no one really expected it at that point in time. There had been no, as far as we were aware, no recent downturn, no crisis, no nothing. He got up, I guess, on Thursday morning, early, as his custom is, and had taken care of his morning. I guess he'd had a little something to eat, and had sat down in actually Loma's chair. They had actually fixed up the small room that Loma used up there with a television set in the chair, because he did not go downstairs nowadays. And he had sat down to watch television in the morning, and he nodded off to sleep and died in his sleep, sitting there in his chair. I guess the doctor determined the time of death to be, or at the time that at least it was discovered, was 5:59 local time on Thursday morning, so he died in his sleep. Mr. Ted Armstrong heard from his sister Beverly, I believe, shortly thereafter about Mr. Armstrong's death. As soon as he hung up from her, Aaron Dean from the college, or the church, called him with official notification and the information about the funeral. And the church is, the Worldwide Church of God, the officials are treating Ted's family with all consideration. They've arranged housing for them on the campus. They have arranged for limousines to take them to the funeral. So I did appreciate the fact that they are treating them, with full propriety through this situation. There's to be a memorial service in the auditorium today for employees of the church, a private funeral tomorrow for the family and close friends, and I'm sure a few officials of the church who will be there at that time. We've been getting calls this week from, since Thursday morning from all over. Thursday was a very, very busy day for Mr. Armstrong. He came in a little late, naturally, having gotten the information, but he had no more than gotten here until the phone was ringing off the wall with news media, and he felt he could not just stay away from them, so he spent most of Thursday until well into the evening, Thursday evening, talking to reporters, talking to people. Actually we had, I think, two television crews came out to the office, one here locally, and Channel 4 Dallas brought their helicopter over and brought a team over to interview Mr. Ted Armstrong Thursday evening. They got here, I think they may have been the last interview he did before he shut down for the night and went home to rest his voice, because his voice getting very fuzzy by the time the day was over. They flew out yesterday to Pasadena. Mr. Armstrong held a news conference there yesterday afternoon in order to try to handle everything out there at once, not have to be dealing with them repeatedly, with phone calls through the whole period of time. And that does seem to have accomplished that, and the news coverage on it has been pretty thorough. As Larry mentioned, it's been on L.A. on Thursday, it was every 20 minutes on the radio you could hear that it was being announced, because Herbert Armstrong and, of course, the church was very well known in the Pasadena and Los Angeles area. Probably the most asked question through all of this is, that people ask me, is, did Mr. Ted Armstrong, get to see his father or speak to his father before he died? And he did not. Perhaps if Mr. Armstrong had been aware that he was not going to live through the night or another day, he might have called for his children. In fact, it was indicated that it was his intention to do so. But then the indications are that he had no thought that his death was that close or that imminent, and consequently that was never done. A lot of the people who have called and asked, when I have told them that, have really expressed profound sadness and deep sympathy with Mr. Ted Armstrong that he was not able to see his father. As one put it to me, the death of his father was not a great tragedy in the sense that the man was 93 years old. The tragedy was that father and son remained separated until the day of the father's death. And I know that Ted, I do intend to convey to him on behalf of all the people I've heard from, and I'm sure on behalf of all of you, our regrets that he wasn't able to see his father and to have that communication with him at that time. I think a lot of people in the Church of God International who were never members of the Worldwide Church of God probably do not have quite the feeling or the awareness of what's involved in our history and the rather profound influence, actually, that Herbert W. Armstrong had on so many of us, and consequently has, even to this day, on the Church of God International. A lot of people really don't like to hear that. They would really like to think that it wasn't quite that way, but that's not realistic. Realistically, you have to understand that the influences of Herbert W. Armstrong and the Worldwide Church of God on this church are very, very real, and they're going to be a factor in the Church of God International for years to come. For one thing, it's, the most obvious thing is that Garner Ted Armstrong is Herbert W. Armstrong's son. As he was explaining to reporters this week, he has his father's genes, he has his father's voice, he has even some of his father's looks, he has his father's mouth, and for many, many years, he imbued of and bought into, I guess, or accepted or drunk of his father's spirit, his father's philosophy, his father's approach to so many things. He, of course, is also his mother's son. There are very many differences between Mr. Ted Armstrong and his father, but it would be silly on our part, or foolish, to ignore the similarities and the things that are very much the same between the two of them. You also have to realize that every minister in the CGI, as far as I can recall at the moment, every one of them was formerly a member of the Worldwide Church of God. Most of them are, I think probably still to say most of the ministers were ministers in the Worldwide Church of God beforehand. The educational foundation of our, if you'll call it this, ideology, or of our theology, of our basic thrust and our basic ideas of the church and how it works were formed in Ambassador College in the 50s and 60s. And I emphasize the time element because there is quite a difference in Ambassador College depending upon what particular time era you look at that institution. So that is, I think, something that has to be understood. I mean, the old AC is where our philosophical foundations were laid, and that is the philosophical foundations of our ministry, who in turn have taught the remainder of men who were not ministers in the Worldwide Church of God, but they were members and they were taught there. That Ambassador College and its faculty, not merely Herbert W. Armstrong, but its faculty, were responsible for developing that foundation of doctrine, of belief, of concept that shapes so much of what we have to do. For another thing, there will also be a steady trickle of Worldwide Church of God members to the Church of God International for years to come. If we're still around here doing God's work 20 years from now, and the Worldwide Church of God survives and we survive, there will be that trickle of people moving this direction from the Worldwide Church of God. And it's going, so consequently we have to realize that the influence, and that, as Herbert W. Armstrong has quoted someone else as saying, that every institution is the lengthened shadow of one man. The Worldwide Church of God is that. But that shadow sometimes does reach over into the Church of God International. And I feel that the failure to acknowledge this and to deal with it effectively could seriously inhibit our growth, and it could seriously inhibit our development as a church if we do not understand our roots, if we do not know where they are, if we do not realize the direction that we have come to arrive where we are. We may not have a good feeling for the direction we may want to proceed from here to where we want to be. For example, where is the Bible education of our future ministry coming from? Where's it going to come from? Because we are going to have ministers in the future. And as time goes by, a larger and larger percentage of those ministers not only will not have been ministers in the Worldwide Church of God, they will not even have been members in the Worldwide Church of God. For the time will come, it may be in a year, it may be 2, it may be 5, I don't really know when, the sooner the better, when we will ordain our first minister who has never been a member of the Worldwide Church of God. Where is he going to get his Bible education? For indeed, we do not want our ministry to be uneducated in the Bible, do we? Are they going to get it purely from tapes on their own, just as whatever they can pick up here and there? Is it going to be the Epistles of Paul class on tapes, or is it just going to be sermon tapes over time? Is it going to be kind of a helter-skelter thing that takes place? Are they going to have any grounding in the biblical languages? Are they going to have any grounding in biblical history? Are they going to know anything about how we got the Bible? Are they going to be able to deal with people's questions about the Bible in this way? Or are they just going to be able to give the canned responses that we always give and we write down for people or have in our literature? Is that all there is? I think we have to think about this, because if we don't begin to think in terms of teaching and training the future leadership of the church, sooner or later, and it may be 1 year, it may be 5, we're going to hit a leadership crisis in this church. For we cannot depend on, for our future development and growth, the leadership coming to us from the Worldwide Church of God. For that, as time goes by, we will be depending on leadership that was developed later, and the leadership that's been developed later in the Worldwide Church of God is of a very different caliber from the leadership that was developed early in the Worldwide Church of God, and many of you are unaware of that, especially those of you who were never in the Worldwide Church of God, but also those of you who were, are really not aware of that to the extent some of us are who have been involved in the whole thing from very early years until today. I really can hardly consider myself a pioneer in the church. When I came to Ambassador College in 1958, I felt like I was a relative latecomer. And yet, to give you an idea, I was the 42nd minister ordained in the Worldwide Church of God, number 42. Now, that seems like a very early number because some of the men who are ahead of me aren't there anymore. C. Paul Meredith is dead. So consequently, my seniority, if I were there as far as the number on the list, would be pretty high as far as those people who were around from the very early times. I knew Herbert W. Armstrong personally. Whatever faults the man may have had, and I'm sure he had many, the Herbert Armstrong I knew was a man of vision. Allie and I left Abilene, Texas in the autumn of 1958. We had been accepted as students at Ambassador College. I was 24 years old. We had already been married 5 years at the time. And we had applied for Ambassador College, been very concerned about what was going to happen. I had to send a telegram out to see whether I'd been accepted because I needed to know what to do in Abilene. And I got a telegram back that said, well, we're not sure. Few older men accepted. 24 was an older man. Of course, that among college freshmen, I guess you would be. But I was accepted. We jumped in our little 54 Chevrolet and put all of our worldly belongings in a 5x12 trailer and started out across West Texas and across the desert to Pasadena. Arrived in Pasadena in time for school to begin and so forth to look for an apartment. Drove up, missed the campus completely. I had gotten all the brochures and looked at them and saw, well, it must be a big, huge place because they use wide-angle lenses. You know what that does. So I drove to the address and drove by and this must not be the place. Missed it completely. Turned around and went back and finally located the buildings of the college and went in and began to meet for the first time many of the people involved in the church. In those days, of course, pictures of Herbert W. Armstrong were very scarce. He did not publish his picture very much at all in the Plain Truth magazine. In fact, I think all of the PTs that I had got prior to my going out there, I had still not seen his picture in the Plain Truth. I think somebody showed it to me in an annual, and I had seen one photograph of Herbert W. Armstrong. When I finally did see the man, he was a disappointment almost because he was much, much shorter. He was a short, rotund man, and yet, he had a kindly face and a white mane of hair. And when I went into to give you a feeling of how things were, I went into my first assembly in college with all the students that were there. Actually, no, I'm sorry, with the freshman class. My freshman class in college was about this size, maybe a little bit bigger. I think we had 70 people in my freshman class. We were all sitting there, and Mr. Armstrong came in up to the front and stood in front of us all and said, "And greetings, friends around the world." And his voice is unique. And that sound, of course, for all of us who have been listening to him on the radio for so long, kind of made the gooseflesh stand up on our body. He had one of the best voices, maybe the best voice ever in radio. It was clearly identifiable. It was resonant. He was well-spoken. His diction was good. He just was a presence on radio. And, of course, in person, initially, he didn't carry that presence. And it was so surprising. I'd expect him to be a much taller man. I'd visualize him with coal black hair. And that isn't what I got. I got a short gentleman, rotund, with thinning gray hair. But, boy, the voice was there. And the charisma was there. Herbert Armstrong had a knack of making you want to do whatever it was he wanted to do, as most charismatic people do. For some reason, you wanted to make him happy. You wanted to please him. Or you wanted to work. Whatever the vision was he had, you wanted to share it. And he was a man who very definitely had a vision. Now, it was the custom in those days. Mr. Herbert Armstrong had a class called, I think they changed the title of it later to Principles of Living, but when I got to college, it was called the sex class. Just pure and simple. Now, everything he taught us about sex could easily have been taken care of in a week. The class, though, if I recall, went on the whole year, didn't it? Was it a full year, or was it one semester? One semester, okay. The important thing about that class was that this was Herbert Armstrong's chance to be in touch with, take questions from, present his ideas and his concepts to the freshmen, the brand new freshmen in college. And he, for many, many years, maintained that contact with every freshman class. We'd go to class and sit down, and he'd come in with his textbooks and so forth, but he would also come in with a rolled-up set of plans under his arm. And he would go up to the board, and he would put these things out and pin them up there, and here would be the architect's design for a new building that he was planning for the campus. He would talk about the new building and the plans for the work, and I was just talking to this radio station today and that radio station the other day, and we're going ahead. By the time we got through that semester, he had thoroughly infused us with a vision, and his vision, of what he saw the work to be, and about how he felt we were going to accomplish that work. He was good at it, very good at it, and as I said, in those days, very determined to have that contact with every student and to maintain his contact with the student body. In those days, Mr. Armstrong had the whole freshman class over to his house for a party sometime early in the first few weeks of school. Well, as it happens, I had to work that evening, or for some reason, my wife and I were not able to go, and also Richard Plesset and his wife were not able to go on that occasion. And later on, Mr. Armstrong, because we had missed it, he invited the two of us over to his home separately, the four of us. So we went over and visited, he showed us his home, and then he and Mrs. Armstrong took us to dinner at the Honker restaurant. So we had really a rare privilege. This was my first real contact with Mr. Herbert Armstrong. And instead of just being one of 70 freshmen milling around his house and shaking his hand, we got to spend the whole evening with him, talk for a while, go to dinner, and come back home. And before the evening was over, he stood between Richard Plauché and I, Richard Plauché is about 6'5", and I'm 6'3". He put one arm in my arm, and he put the other arm in Richard's. You know what I feel like? There was a smug look on his face. No. I feel like a nickel and a dime between two nickels. And at that time, we were quite content to accept that evaluation because we had a great deal of respect for the man and the work that he was doing and the work that he had done, because even by that time, an enormous amount had been accomplished in the building of the institution that we were already becoming a part of and beginning to buy into, as it were. I began my job on the campus as a trash collector. I drove the college trash truck. I went around, emptied all the barrels of trash, and took them out to the city dump. And Richard Plauché, I think, was working on the grounds, raking leaves or doing something. No, he was a member of the janitor's crew. He was cleaning toilets at the time. So he had a janitor and a garbage collector over at his home for dinner. But he did want to get to know a little bit about us. I think part of his interest in us, he wanted to see what we were made out of, because both Richard and I had previously been preachers in another church, and I think he had to just check out to be sure what sort of folk we were along the way. During my 2 years, really, and 3 years, really, in college before I got along too far, I got to know Mr. Herbert Armstrong a little bit. I got to know Ted Armstrong a little bit. But it was really after I got transferred to Brickett Wood that I really began to know Mr. Herbert Armstrong, because when he came to Brickett Wood, it was like it was in Pasadena in the old days. It was a new college, it was a young college, it was a small group of people, and the faculty was small, and everyone could relate to Mr. Armstrong. And he had a habit of once a week at the least, every day for lunch, of going up to the faculty dining room. So when he was in Brickett Wood, we had lunch with Mr. Armstrong every day that he was there. We'd go up and sit and talk, and we could ask questions, and he could talk to us, and would convey his thoughts, his ideas, his plans, his hopes, his dreams, his vision, again, of the work to all of us during this period of time. It was pretty continued on this way until 1967, when Mrs. Armstrong died. And it was really quite a long time after her death that most of us who were associated with the Armstrongs began to realize that what we had when we were dealing with the Armstrongs was really a combined vision of the work. Herbert Armstrong had a vision of the work and of what he intended to accomplish. And Mrs. Armstrong also had a vision of the work and where it should go and what it should be. And those two were intermeshed and locked together very much. And she was a profound influence on him. Some changes began to take place right after her death. Some of them were expected and obvious and had to be dealt with. Mr. Armstrong became a very lonely man right after her death. It was very painfully obvious in Brickett Wood, because when he would come over to Brickett Wood and be there without her, he was there in his home, a little cottage on campus, all by himself, and he would, instead of, what he would do is call Myrtle Horn, and he would say, let's set up something up in the faculty dining room, and then word would be passed to the rest of us that Mr. Armstrong was going to eat up there, and we did not want to let him eat alone. And so for a long time, whenever he was in Brickett Wood, every evening, most of us in the faculty, we'd sometimes spell one another, but to take a break, but every one of us in the faculty would go up to the faculty dining room, have dinner with Mr. Armstrong, chat and talk with him, then we would adjourn to his house. And that's when Mr. Armstrong learned to play harp. We would oftentimes play cards on into the evening until he began to get a bit tired, and we would all be a little tired and drift off to home. And during this time, also, my awareness of him and his awareness of me, we became quite good friends during those years. That many of us that he did consult from time to time, and he always saw fit to consult me about his letters and about articles that he was writing, along with Charles Hunting, Raymond McNair, and others. And we really felt like we were very much a part of what he was doing. And I think he wanted us to feel a part of what he was doing. He took advice. He was very quick to realize when someone brought up a problem with a letter that he could see the problem and he needed to change it, and was very receptive to these things in these days. In those years, he was a man who believed that in multitude of counsel there was safety, and he sought that counsel consistently in all the things that he was planning and all the things he was doing. We'd be in a conference, and he would read a letter to us. Raymond McNair would point out a couple of things that were either grammatically not quite correct or that should be possibly changed. I would raise a question or two. Charles Hunting would bring up some things that he had in mind. Ernest Martin, who was there in those days, would make a suggestion or two. And then he would modify his letter or his chapter, or he'd say, I see your point, or he'd say no, and he'd explain why. It was a fascinating time, and an interesting chance to be with the man and to see how he functioned and to get a little bit of a feeling for the kind of a man that he was in those days and in those years. He did have, as I said, a very clear vision of the work and of the purpose of what he was doing. He had a philosophy for the development even of the physical plant of the college. When I was there, it troubled me a few times because the college would occasionally be in financial condition, and whenever they got in financial problems, they didn't pay people. Now, you could go in and ask for your paycheck if you had to have it, but all of us had our hearts in the work. You know, we wanted the work to go ahead, and if the work was in financial trouble, well, we would try not to do so. I know there was a time when I was 13 weeks behind in my salary pay. We had nothing but beans to eat in the cupboard, and one day I was working down on the campus, and here rolls in this huge, long semi-truck, open semi in the back, with a full-grown rubber tree. And I'm sorry, with a big crane, and right behind it a tree with a full-grown rubber tree on the back of it. The rubber trees they have big old leaves and make beautiful landscape. This thing would have been, 40 feet high, I think the tree might have been. Huge, full-grown. And they proceeded, spending most of the day, to dig a hole in the ground, reach that tree up, plant that tree in the ground up there, and get it all right, and then leave. I looked a long time at that, and thought about the beans in the cupboard at home, and thought about my 13 weeks of pay that I had not received, and kind of groaned within myself a little bit about it, and didn't think that was really the way things ought to be done, and I to this day do not feel that is the way things ought to be done. But Herbert Armstrong was not aware of the fact that I was 13 weeks behind in my pay and was going hungry. What he was aware of was the fact that his philosophy was to build a campus, an institution, whose physical plant would knock your eye out, so that whenever he invited a radio station manager or an advertising representative or somebody with whom we were doing business to the college, they would come on, they would see that we were of substance, that it was not a fly-by-night outfit, that it was a very, the organization had meaning, it had purpose, that there was beauty here, that it was impressive to anybody that we had to deal with. And he felt that was important because so much of the time, at that period of time, if you were driving across West Texas sometime late at night, and you'd listen to Herbert Armstrong, and then after Herbert Armstrong would go off the air, here comes a fellow on there who's a preacher going on about these prosperity billfolds. And if you will send him $2 or it's $5 through the mail, depending on whether you send him $2 or $5, which billfold you got. It's free, though. This prosperity billfold. He spent the whole 15 minutes going through reading these testimonies. I got your prosperity billfold, and I got a check in the mail for $50 the next day. And he'd read all these things off. And then there was, first one preacher and then another, and some of those people may still be on down there. One of them had his $10 gift packet, and another one had his $12 or his $20 gift packet. It had a hymnal and a Bible and a cross that glowed in the dark and a picture of Jesus and things like that. Well, one of the things that Herbert Armstrong was desperate to do was to distance himself from that type of radio evangelist. And he worked hard at doing it, and the whole concept of the development of the physical plant was to instill in students' minds, to instill in everybody's mind, that this is a quality organization. It was, I have little doubt, overdone. I have no doubt that mistakes were made, but his philosophy worked. Because while we made enough mistakes in other areas to cause people to ask some very serious questions about the institution and the way we dealt with people and some odds and ends like that, no one ever questioned us as far as being fly-by-night or here to stay or quality in our orientation. And I really honestly believe that it had an effect on those of us who went to Ambassador College. I'm just an old country boy myself. I come from the hills of Arkansas. And, I'd spent 4 years in the Navy before I came there. But when I went to Herbert Armstrong's home that night, I had never been in a home that nice. And when he took me to that restaurant that night, which was the Old Honker in Pasadena, which was not, it was a good restaurant, but it was not outstanding. To me, I had, the food was great, the service was good. I had never seen anything like it. It raised my sight considerably from where they had been before. It made me realize, some concepts of behavior, some concepts of quality, some concepts of better things, which in themselves should never become an object. And in the earlier years, it was not Herbert's idea to make these things become our objective. It was simply to change our outlook on life so that we would be ambassadors for Christ. And in the early years of college, this was done very effectively. And the approach at the same time was to help you to learn humility and not to be exalted in your own eyes, not to think that you deserved all these great things, but in humility to accept them, to use them in God's honor, and then go out and represent yourself as the kind of a quality person in your dealings with other people. This was what was taught. We were taught it in class. It was discussed in forums. There were speeches in Ambassador Club about it. Table topic sessions were held on it. This was the vision, part of the vision, that Herbert Armstrong had conveyed to us over that period of time. Now, the work also, though, in those days was influenced by the people who came to it. A lot of them, for example, prior to the time I had got there, the broadcasts had been on some of these old Mexican stations down here, and they'd gone beamed right up through the Bible Belt part of the United States. So there was a category of people that had come into the church at that period of time, and that group of people had had some influence on the direction and the thinking and thought processes of the church. There was a very heavy conservative element that came into the church at that time. A lot of people have been under the impression that Mr. Herbert Armstrong is a conservative. He is not. Mr. Ted Armstrong is more conservative than his father, and I say that with all authority and with all knowledge whereof I speak, and I can prove it to anybody that's objective and open-minded and wants to talk about the thing. Then people will wonder, well, where did some of these things come from? Well, they came from a lot of the people who came to the institution with other ideas and began to promulgate them or preach them or teach them or argue them, because in the earlier days of Ambassador College, there was considerable more freedom of expression in your ideas, your thoughts, and your freedom than there began to be in later years. I was, for example, many people have been shocked when I've told them that I came to Ambassador College as a freshman. It was accepted that you could disagree with what was taught in the classroom. In fact, I think it was even in the college catalog that students were encouraged to question, to disagree, to search, to research, to prove, to test. Well, I saw it in the catalog, and I believed it was true, so I did it when I came to college. Roderick C. Meredith, who represents a very strong conservative element in the Church of God, the Worldwide Church of God, who taught me freshman Bible and the epistles of Paul, stood up in his class for an examination, handed out the examination papers, and said, now, if you disagree with what I have taught you in the class, and I've asked you the questions on the examination, I want you at the top of your examination question to write the word disagree, and then write what you feel is true. And I will grade you, not on whether I agree with you or not, but how well you present your idea, the way you structure it, the way you bring about your proofs. He said, I'll grade you objectively, even though I may think you are wrong. People who have heard me say that really didn't believe it, had a hard time believing that it was that way, but it was. You could get up in Ambassador Club and expound. You weren't supposed to give sermonettes or preach on Bible topics because that wasn't what the club was for. But, you could espouse all sorts of ideas and concepts and thoughts. So people came in who had ideas of their own, which they persuaded others and sometimes even tried to persuade Mr. Armstrong. The church's idea that developed about 1954 of church government really did not originate with Herbert W. Armstrong. It originated with a minister in the church who was of German extraction and had, I think at one time in his life, thought Adolf Hitler was a great man and was going to rescue Germany and perhaps other parts of the world from certain things. And so his idea of church government, which he began to promulgate to Mr. Herbert Armstrong, he was very influential in establishing the doctrine of church government that existed then, which was not a big problem then, but has become quite a large problem for the church in later years. Actually, this began to be promulgated and brought in by other people during that time. In those early years of the college, when I was a freshman there, Mr. Armstrong, I remember distinctly that he declared that he was not an apostle. Not only was he not an apostle, he didn't want to hear anybody saying he was an apostle. And I remember hearing someone suggest, well, Mr. Armstrong, I think quite sure is an apostle. And one of the the senior students, old heads, said, you better not let Mr. Armstrong hear you say that. He had called someone down for stating that he was an apostle, because in those years, he did not make that claim, did not want it made in those days. He had an ego in those days, but it was very much tempered. I will say this, no man could possibly lead an organization or make it develop like he was called upon to do, who did not have some ego. Just, you might as well realize that without some ego, without confidence in himself, without some awareness of his ability to perform, a man can't do that. That was very much there in the Herbert Armstrong of those years. But at least in those days, he worked hard to try to give God credit for what he did. I remember one night in Bible study down in the old Shakespeare Club, I was sitting there and he came in, he sat down in the chair and he looked tired. And he said, I'm exhausted. He said, I'm absolutely worn out. He said, I know clearly that I have not done any of the things that have been done in this work. God has done it. I have not done any of it. He said, but I have had to work as hard as if I had done it all myself. Repeatedly, he'd make a statement. I remember once in Bible study out there, or a sermon, he said, I know the time is going to come when Jesus Christ returns and my resurrection and I'm there, and he's going to look at me and he's going to say, Herbert, you don't know how much trouble you caused me. So in those days there was a humility that was there. And certainly all the years that Mrs. Armstrong was there was that humility. And things did begin to change, of course, in later times, but we're going to do a little reversal on Brutus speaks about Julius Caesar. You know, the evil that men do lives after them, the good is often interred with their bones. So let it be with Caesar. Well, that, you know, history will tell its lesson, but I think today is a time when we need to really reflect for a moment on the accomplishments that were done, the things that were actually brought about. In those years, the Bible was the ultimate authority for everything that was done in a church. Ultimate. For example, Herbert Armstrong and Ted Armstrong both were on the air, and both of them heard them both say it. Don't believe me. Believe your Bible. It was the watchword. They get to college. Standing in here we are in class, and the teacher says, don't believe me. Look in your Bible. Mr. Herbert Armstrong, in a sermon on the Sabbath, says, don't believe me. It's right there in your Bible. Now, they told me that again and again and again as I came into the church and into the college, and I bought that. That was the contract under which I signed on with the organization, that I would not have to believe anybody unless I could find it proved in the pages of my Bible. Ted told me that. His father told me that. The Bible, again, was the ultimate authority, and that had a profound influence on the church, the work, and everything that it did. And we had a ministerial conference. I remember the first conference that I attended. I was not yet ordained the first conference that I attended. The objective of the conference was to deal with certain questions that the church ministers and members had about various issues that had faced the church, and for the ministry to make a decision. And I remember Mr. Armstrong, with all the ministers assembled there, saying, with a great deal of pride, saying, you know, he said, all these years and all these conferences, every decision we have made was a unanimous decision. Now, I was interested by that at the time. That spoke volumes about the way in which the church did business. That it was not a question of someone unilaterally making a decision. It was a question of the ministers meeting together under the direction of their leader, having a free and open discussion about what was going on. And some of those discussions were pretty free and pretty open. The first one I attended was a real eye-opener for me because Mr. Ted Armstrong and Roderick Meredith were agreeing with each other in disagreement with Mr. Herbert Armstrong. And it got real interesting there for a while. Mr. Herbert Armstrong finally tacked both of their hides to the wall, to use the old Texas expression. But still, there was that free and open exchange, and we went round and round with it, and finally the ministry came to an agreement about what was to be done. I didn't remember what the issue was at the time, which shows you how important it was. But nevertheless, it was a ministerial conference in which the ministry were involved in making decisions. Kind of interesting how that was in those days. Now, Herbert Armstrong's vision that he had in those days was what we came to call the work. And this was, I don't know, would you call it the watchword? The motto of Ambassador College was to recapture true values. And we talked about that a lot. But the ultimate value that we were concerning ourselves with was the work. Everything was oriented toward the work. Graduates from the college, if they managed to get all the way through college and graduate, by that time the work was growing so rapidly that they were hired by the work. And so our heart and our mind was the work. I want to be in the work. I want to have a part in God's work. And this is the work, God's work. You know, we spoke of it constantly. It was on all of our thoughts all of the time. Herbert Armstrong had succeeded really imbuing all of us with a concept of the work. Now, what was the work as we saw it in those days, in those times? As I say, one of the things that I want to try to convey to everyone here today is a little bit of an awareness of how we have gotten to where we are, the roots, the philosophical concepts, the things that have made us think the way we do about different things. This is the ultimate value that we looked at in those days in the college. Matthew 28, verses 19 and 20. Go ye therefore and teach all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all things whatsoever I have commanded you. And lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the world. This is the first commission to the church. Now, also, if you'll turn over a few pages to John chapter 21. John chapter 21 and verse 15. When they had dined, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of Jonas, do you love me more than these? He said, Yes, Lord, you know that I love you. He said to him, Feed my lambs. He said again to him the second time, Simon, son of Jonas, do you love me? And he said to him, Yes, Lord, you know that I love you. He said to him, Feed my sheep. This was repeated 3 times total in dealing with Peter, and Jesus impressed upon his mind what we in the church came to call the second commission. Our division, as I say, of Herbert Armstrong is what the work was a first and second commission. The first commission was to preach the gospel throughout the world as a witness and a warning, not necessarily to convert. There would be conversions. They were expected and hoped for and to be dealt with, because if there were no conversions, there would be no flock to feed. But the first commission was to feed the flock. The first commission was to preach the gospel. The second commission was to feed the flock. I think a very important concept. Now, as this fell out, we never became confused about which was first and which was second. In the work, and through all those years, and all of my time of involvement with him, even though we sometimes said, well, it isn't really 2 commissions, it's 1 commission. It is a twofold commission, or a two-sided, or 2 aspects to the commission. There still had to be the recognition that there might come times when one responsibility or the other might come into conflict, or the resources were not enough to do both and one could only do one. The fact of the matter was that through that period of time, we knew that the first commission was to preach the gospel. Now, this concept is still with us in the Church of God International, and it should be. Because if the first commission isn't carried out, there will be no flock to feed. Just that simple. Logic demands that of the 2 commissions, to preach the gospel and feed the flock, preaching the gospel is the first commission. Feeding the flock is second. And I think you have to realize, all of you who will hear my voice that are part of the Church of God International, that concept lies very deep in all of us who were brought up in the church during those years. It is something which we have believed right down to the very core of our being, and anyone who expects us to neglect the preaching of the gospel in order to feed the flock has grabbed hold of the wrong end of what we're going to be doing in the years ahead. It simply will not happen. Now, we are going to build local churches. We're going to have local churches. We're going to have a field ministry. We're going to build local church buildings, I have no doubt, in the years to come. We're going to establish educational institutions to train ministers to go out and feed the flock. We are going to, hopefully, if time goes on long enough and God grants us the resources, we would probably develop a 4-year liberal arts, fully accredited university or college. I would hope so, if we're here long enough. I will not today try to go into all the aspects of the importance of education. All those things will be done, but they will be done as the shaft of the spear behind the head of the spear, of which the point is preaching the gospel to the world for a witness. The first commission to the church. That's a part of our roots. In fact, it is not only root, it's also branch, it's what we live for. In those days, it was our raison d'etre, it was our reason for being. It was what we lived for, it's what we breathed for. We lived, breathed, ate, slept, everything else, the work. If a person wants to do it the other way, there is no need to request a change in the Church of God International. The Church of God Seventh Day is already in place. They are good people. They are converted people, from anything I can see. They are kind people. They follow Christian principles, and they have a viable church which believes that putting in feeding the flock first, which apparently that's what they do. And you can actually see the difference in the results of what has been done in the approach they have taken. Now, of course, in some extent, in the worldwide Church of God today, now, you may begin to see the fruits of having gotten unbalanced the other direction. Time will tell exactly what all that means, and history will discuss the right or the wrong of many of these things that have been done. Because you see, in the worldwide Church of God, there was a distortion of all this after 1967. A lot of the things that I bought into, the contract that I accepted, a lot of those things began to be changed after that time, and the change took place very subtly over time. Mr. Herbert Armstrong began to spend an enormous amount of time away from Pasadena, and other people began to become very influential in the way things that were being done, and yet Mr. Ted Armstrong, who was supposed to be nominally running the work in Mr. Armstrong's absence, really did not have the authority to do it either, as many of us who were associated with it do know. There became a much heavier emphasis on the exclusivity of the church and the fact that there was no need for any response on their part if we were preaching the gospel. Prior to that time, we looked upon the response to the gospel as a measure of how well we were getting it out. In other words, if we preached it out there and we got no response back from it, we had to conclude we weren't doing very well. If we preached it out there and we got letters back in baptism, we thought, we are doing our work better. We can see that we are doing our work better. After 1967, slowly a shift began to take place in which any kind of responses were downplayed as a factor in doing the work. Another thing that happened to us after 1967 was by that time we already began to realize that 1972 was not going to do what we expected it to do. We had, of course, attained a high degree of urgency in the church in those years, and a lot of that urgency had to do with time. And when that false hope disappeared, a lot of hope went for a lot of people. A lot of direction began to disappear for a lot of people. A lot of their awareness of where the work should be going and what it should be doing became quite fuzzy. There was heavier emphasis on control, apostleship, government. Because you see, in the early days, the church was not the government of God. The gospel was a message about the government of God, which was to come to this earth. You see, the Bible speaks of the kingdom of God. Well, what is a kingdom? Well, a kingdom is a government. And our message is a message of government. But in those days, the message of government meant the government of God is in heaven, and it is going to come to this earth when Jesus returns, and then and only then will the government of God be on this earth. Now, as time went by, we began to find the message of government being preached in different ways. We found that message of government was supposed to come right on down to the church today, and it finally got to the place where the church became where the government of God is. Now, what is remarkable about this is that there are many churches around this. You'll find some around this town right here. If you went and asked, what is the kingdom of God, would tell you it is the church. The kingdom of God is the church. We, in many years gone by, have denied that the kingdom of God is the church, but now the government of God is the church. And there has been a change, and I don't know when it took place, and I'm not really quite sure how it took place. It's been really since 1978 that it has come to fruition in the church. It's a very different concept from the one we started before, and it has heavily distorted the work, the gospel. What the work is supposed to accomplish is no longer viewed quite the same by those who were involved with it there. By 1978, the vision was blurred. I had been eaten up by politics because the old urgency had been gone. The expectation of Christ's immediate return, that which kept a lot of people just driving on and making sacrifices, personal sacrifices, financial sacrifices, sometimes working themselves to death. I know that one or two ministers said, I'd rather burn out than rust out, and I'm pacing myself, and I want to come to the place where my body gives up in 1975. Some of them, I think their body just about did give up on them. It may have lasted a little beyond 1975 because some very severe health problems among some of my old friends who followed that philosophy back in those years. So consequently, they used it all up. The old urgency got done. The problem was that even though the urgency was gone, the work had not been finished. Still wasn't over. By anybody's definition, really, of what the work is, it was not over. And I'm reminded of the old song. I mentioned it to you before, of a popular song from some years back. The line in it went this way: I don't know where we went wrong, but the feeling's gone, and I just can't get it back. And I really honestly feel an awful lot of people in the ministry and elsewhere had come to the place to where the feeling was gone, and they just somehow were not able to pull that back. And Herbert Armstrong himself had come to the place in his life where he was really detached from the work, and where he himself was old and physically unable to convey the kind of urgency he had conveyed in years gone by. And too many changes had taken place. The work had become so politicized that even had he wanted to do some of those things, he might never have done it. Herbert Armstrong, whatever his faults may have been, was allowed to catch a vision of the work of God. He really was. And for 52 years, however imperfectly, he worked for it. And his efforts bore fruit. Here you are. You do have to realize that, don't you? That even those of you who've never heard him preach, even those of you who've never seen him in the flesh, even those of you who to this day may have a certain disrespect for the man because of some errors that either he or somebody around him has made in years gone by, you're here because of the fruits of work, foundations that were laid, and sacrifices that were made by Herbert Armstrong many, many years ago. I could be ashamed, really, for his death to pass without at least a nod in that direction and awareness of the influence that he's been, because I don't know of any human being, frankly, who has been more influential on my life than Herbert W. Armstrong has been. Most ways good, some ways not so good. But those things that are not so good can always be straightened out. And a person's got to be awfully careful to straighten out the things that need to be straightened out and not throw out the good while you're at it. He worked at it for 52 years. The reason I'm so clear about the 52 years is that the day he started the broadcast was the first Sunday in January of 1934, was the day I was born. 52 years. All those years I was growing up, he was up there in Oregon for a period of time, going down there and driving down, putting his program on the air. And then during part of the time I was growing up, he was down trying to get Ambassador College established through all that he did there. And it's incredible what was able to be done. If God wasn't with him, he really sure did accomplish an awful lot for a man who I don't know, did he even graduate from high school? I don't think he did he? He certainly did not go to college. So, I think we need to acknowledge that. Herbert W. Armstrong's work, though, now is finished. But the acknowledgement has got to be made that God's work is not. You just flat can't get around it. In the 24th chapter of Matthew, again, I'd like to just point out a little thing from where we are and where we might be headed. 24th chapter of Matthew. Jesus had been there with his disciples, and they had been pointing out all the buildings of the temple. And Jesus said, oh yes, it's an impressive edifice, but I want you to understand something. There's not one stone here upon top of another that will not be thrown down. It must have stunned them. It must have shocked them to the core of their being. And they went down and found a place to wait upon the Mount of Olives, and they came to him privately and said, tell us, when shall these things be, and what shall be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? He answered and said to them, take heed that no man deceive you, for many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and shall deceive many. You shall hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you be not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. Nation shall rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There shall be famines and pestilences and earthquakes in divers places. All these are just the beginning. Then shall they deliver you up to be afflicted, and shall kill you, and you shall be hated of all nations for my name's sake. Then shall many be offended, and shall betray one another, and shall hate one another. Many false prophets shall arise, and shall deceive many. And because iniquity shall abound, the love of many shall wax cold. He that shall endure to the end, the same shall be saved. This gospel, not any gospel, not just any kind of good news, not just any message that a preacher wants to preach, or not just the name of Jesus Christ or whatever, this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness unto all nations, and then the end shall come. We're not there yet. We've not arrived at that particular point. Herbert Armstrong's work is over. God's work is not. It's very easy for people to feel that what we do makes little real difference in the overall scheme of things. Simplest manifestation of it is on election day, when the question of whether I will go to the trouble of getting myself up and getting all organized and going down and standing in line and maybe being there for a half hour in order to cast one vote in what I know is going to be a losing cause. Real test. And a lot of us don't do it because we have this feeling that what we do doesn't make much difference. And I think a lot of times in the church that people who are in the field or, off by themselves or in a local church somewhere, they feel, well, there are the people out there at headquarters or, maybe for the Worldwide Church of God, people that will be out in Pasadena, for CGI people, there'll be those fellows down in Tyler. And it's up to them to do the work. They've got the work to do, and what I do out here really doesn't make any difference. If I sent my tithes in, it didn't. It would, they're hard to know the difference, not with my little old tithes that I have to send in. And a lot of times people think, well, what I do doesn't make much difference. One of the things that I often ponder on is the concept in the Worldwide Church of God that almost is that what we do doesn't really make a difference, because the idea is I must preach the gospel, but only those people that God has called will ever accept the gospel, and therefore you preach it, but it may not make any difference. And what your reward, I guess, has got to be is in the fact that you preached it, and it's up to them to take it or leave it. Now there's no question about the statement that only those that God calls may come and all those things. But there is somewhere a deeply flawed theology in that, and I'll tell you why. For if it were true that it was just a question, you just preach the gospel and it really doesn't make any difference whether anybody accepts it or not as long as you preached it, you have got to deal with the incredible, staggering sacrifices that have been made by God's people to preach the gospel down through all generations, not the least of whom was a man named Saul of Tarsus, who on a day when he had preached the gospel in one town, they drug him out, stoned him, and left him for dead under a pile of rocks. Managed to finally get himself up, stagger down the road to the next town, and preach the same gospel that got him stoned in the town up the road. This is a man who was beaten time after time publicly, sometimes by Jews, sometimes by Gentiles. This is a man who had to actually fight with wild beasts in an arena because of his service and preaching of Christ. And Paul keeps on telling us, I do this in order that I may give some ministration to you, may give something to you, may preach the gospel, that the gospel may go out to these people. Paul felt that one man's work made a difference. There is an interesting illustration back in the Old Testament. I want you to turn back to Numbers, the 16th chapter, something you may never have noticed before. It's occasion of a rebellion of Israel. Nothing particularly new about that one. Nothing particularly new at all. But after the rebellion, and after the men had been punished, the earth had opened up and swallowed them. Moses didn't lay a hand on them. The earth opened up and swallowed them down. The people, the congregation of children of Israel, verse 41, number 16, murmured against Moses and against Aaron, saying, you have killed the people of the Lord. Now the earth had opened up and swallowed them. Moses hadn't put a hand on them. It came to pass when the congregation was gathered together against Moses and against Aaron that they looked toward the tabernacle of the congregation, and behold, a cloud covered it, and the glory of the Lord appeared. Moses and Aaron came before the tabernacle of the congregation. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, get away from this congregation, that I may consume them as in a moment. And Moses and Aaron fell on their face. Moses said to Aaron, take a censer, put fire in it off the altar, put on incense, and go quickly into the congregation and make an atonement for them, for there is wrath gone out from the Lord, the plague has begun. These people were all gathered around. They accused Moses and they accused Aaron, and God's wrath. You hear of God's wrath elsewhere in the Bible? A day of God's wrath, a time of his wrath. On this occasion, his wrath began at those people closest and began to spread. And it was like a plague walking its way through the congregation as it went. Aaron took as Moses commanded, and he ran into the midst of the congregation. And behold, the plague was already begun among the people. He put on incense, and he made an atonement for the people. And he stood between the dead and the living, and the plague was stayed. Here's a man who, he says, quickly, do it quickly, move now. He quickly took a censer, put incense on it, and ran. He didn't walk. Now I want you to understand this. He went out there and he found the place where the plague was coming. He stood with that censer between the dead and the living, and the plague stopped when it got to him. How many people died? They that died in the plague were 14,700, besides those who had died on the matter of Korah. 14,700. Question. If Aaron had walked, how many people would have died? If Aaron had stopped for a cup of tea, how many people would have died? If he stood for a moment to argue with Moses, how many people would have died? Would there have been more? Yeah, sure would have been. It was in the hands of one man to determine whether certain of these people lived or died by the urgency with which he carried out his task. Whether he took it to hand, whether he got after it, whether he went and did it, whether he walked around made a difference in what he had to do. There is yet to come a time of wrath upon the earth. We know it is coming, don't we? Don't know how soon, but we know it's coming, and we basically believe it's not that far away, that there are people in this room who will be alive and who will see the day of God's wrath upon this earth. You believe that? I know it. I am certain of it in God's Word. We not only know that it is coming, we know why it's coming. Not only do we know it's coming and we know why it's coming, we know how we can tell when it's close. We really have incredible knowledge when you think about what God has given to us as a warning. We know the way of salvation, don't we? We know how people can be saved from it. We know how they can be saved out of it. We know how they can live and not die. We know these things. We know, in addition to all those other things, we know that we are supposed to do the work, don't we? And when it's all over and the smoke clears, how many do you think there will be on your left hand? And how many do you think there will be on your right hand when you stand between the living and the dead?